Silence has a weight. I know this now. 87 billion people once filled Hive Primus Majoris with the roar of human existence, the grinding of machinery, the screaming of children, the endless drone of voices layered upon voices until individual words became meaningless noise. Now, there is only silence, and me. My name is Cassel Vorn, and I am the last living soul in a city built for billions. The question that haunts me is not how they all died. It is why I survived when everyone else did not. I was nobody important. This is the first truth you must understand. In a hive of 87 billion souls, individual significance is a statistical impossibility. I was Overseer Technician Cassel Vorn, employed by the Adeptus Terra, assigned to the Department of Atmospheric Regulation, Hive Primus Majoris, Sector 47 Gamma, Level 285. My employee designation was ATM 285-473GV00847392. The number contained more identity than my name. My job was to maintain the atmospheric recyclers that provided breathable air to 7 million people across 43 HAB blocks. I monitored pressure gauges, replaced filtration membranes, filed maintenance reports in triplicate, and ensured that the citizens under my jurisdiction continued to breathe without consciously realizing someone made that possible. It was tedious work, necessary work, the kind of labor that keeps the Imperium functioning while receiving no recognition whatsoever. Hive Primus Majoris rose 200 kilometers from the planetary surface, a mountain of plasteel and rockcrete, housing billions of lives stacked vertically in defiance of logic and comfort. The structure was old, built during the dark age of technology, and maintained through 10,000 years of jury-rigged repairs and sacred incomprehension of its original systems. Tech priests claimed to understand its mysteries. They lied. Everyone lied about understanding how the hive truly functioned. We simply kept it running through ritual and hope. The upper spires, levels, 400 through 500, housed the planetary nobility. Governor Mark Helm and his administrative elite lived in relative luxury, their HAB units spacious enough to walk 5 paces in any direction. They had windows, real windows that looked out upon the ash, wastes, and chemical seas of our world. They could see sky. This alone marked them as blessed beyond measure. The middle hive, levels 100 through 399, contained the bulk of the population. Workers, technicians, minor administratum officials, ecclesiarchy priests serving small chapels, Arbites enforcers maintaining order through violence, merchants trading in recycled goods, families living in HAB units, barely large enough to contain a sleeping pallet and basic sanitation. 60 billion people occupied the middle hive. The density was such that you could extend your arms and touch the walls on either side of most corridors. Privacy was a concept that existed only in ancient texts. You were always aware of your neighbors, their sounds, their smells, their lives pressed against yours through thin metal walls. Below level 100 lay the underhive, the forgotten levels, the substrata where imperial law became a distant rumor and survival depended on strength or cunning. Gangs ruled, mutants hid. The desperate and damned carved out existence in the darkness, living off the waste products that filtered down from above. 27 billion people, give or take a few million, existed in the underhive. Nobody counted precisely. Nobody cared to count precisely. I lived on level 285, Sector 47 Gamma, HAB Unit 847,392C. The unit measured 4 meters by 3 meters. It contained a sleeping pallet, a waste reclamation unit, a small heating element for preparing nutrient paste, and enough floor space for 2 people to stand if they did not mind touching. This was home for myself, my wife Meritha, and our daughter Selene. Meritha worked in textile reclamation on level 287. Her job involved processing the clothing of the dead, cleaning and repairing garments so they could be redistributed to the living. In the Imperium, nothing is wasted. Even the dead serve by providing their possessions to those who continue the struggle. She worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days per week. Her hands were permanently stained with the chemicals used in the reclamation process. She never complained. Complaint was inefficient and altered nothing. Selene was 8 years old. She attended educational facility 285G, where she learned Imperial Gothic, basic mathematics, approved prayers to the God Emperor, and the fundamentals of whatever labor she would be assigned upon reaching working age. She was small for her age, thin despite the nutrient paste we provided. Most children in the hive were thin. Food was rationed precisely to provide sufficient calories for continued labor. Abundance was not a consideration. Our life was not happy. Happiness is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford. But our life was predictable, stable. We woke at the same time each day. We consumed our allotted rations. We performed our assigned labors. We returned to our hab unit. We slept. We repeated this cycle until we died, and others took our place in the great mechanism of imperial civilization. This was existence. This was normal. The noise was constant. Always. 24 hours per day. The hum of machinery provided a bass note beneath everything. Ventilation systems moving air through kilometers of ductwork. Generatorum turbines producing power for billions of lights, heating elements, industrial equipment. Water pumps forcing liquid through pipes to every level. Elevators carrying workers between zones. The physical infrastructure of the hive created a mechanical symphony that never ceased. Above the machines, human noise. Millions of voices echoing through metal corridors. Conversations, arguments, prayers, screams. Children crying. Adults shouting. Vendors hawking their recycled wares. Preachers declaring the Emperor's glory. Arbites bellowing orders. The hive created its own language from overlapping sound. You learned to filter it, to hear only what mattered, and let the rest become background texture. The smell was equally omnipresent. 87 billion people in enclosed spaces produce an aroma that defies pleasant description. Unwashed bodies. Recycled air carrying undertones of industrial lubricant. Overheated metal, cooking nutrient paste. Waste reclamation facilities operating at capacity. Incense from ecclesiarchy chapels attempting to mask more organic scents. You adapted. After the first year in the hive, you stopped noticing. The smell became part of you, integrated into your perception of normal. I mention these details because they matter. Because when they vanished, their absence created a void more terrible than their presence ever was. You do not appreciate the roar of human civilization until you experience its silence. My typical day began at 0600 hours. The hab unit's chronometer would emit a sharp beep, dragging me from whatever shallow sleep I had managed. Meritha would rise first, preparing nutrient paste for breakfast while I woke Selene. Our daughter was never eager to wake. She would curl tighter into her thin blanket, murmuring protests, until I gently but firmly pulled her upright. We would eat quickly. The paste was gray-brown, textured like wet sand, flavored with synthetic protein and vitamin supplements. It provided exactly 1,200 calories per serving, sufficient for a day's labor. I would walk Selene to her educational facility. A journey of 12 minutes through corridors packed with other workers moving to their assignments. We would pass the same people each day. I knew none of their names. Anonymous faces in an endless stream of humanity. At the facility entrance, I would place my hand on Selene's head, a gesture of affection that somehow survived from my own childhood. She would look up at me with eyes the same brown as her mother's and smile. Then she would disappear into the facility, and I would continue to my station. The atmospheric regulation station for Sector 47 Gamma occupied a maintenance sublevel between 284 and 285. The space was cramped even by Hive standards, barely 15 meters square, dominated by the massive cylindrical forms of the recycler units. These machines took the exhalation of 7 million people, the industrial emissions of factorums, the chemical byproducts of waste reclamation, and somehow transformed it all back into breathable air. I understood the basic principles: filtration, chemical scrubbing, oxygenation, pressure regulation. The specifics were mysteries maintained by tech priests who visited quarterly to perform rituals I was forbidden to observe. My role was simpler: monitor the gauges, record the readings, replace filtration membranes when they became saturated, clean the intake valves, file reports. If anything malfunctioned beyond my authority to repair, I would submit a request to the Adeptus Mechanicus and wait. Sometimes they responded within days, sometimes within months. The Hive operated on time frames that rendered individual convenience meaningless. I shared the station with 2 other technicians. Horvath, a man of perhaps 50 years, who had worked atmospheric regulation for 3 decades and possessed the permanent wheeze of someone whose lungs had absorbed too much recycled air. And Cassandra, younger than me by a decade, newer to the position, still maintaining the naive belief that our work mattered in some grand sense beyond basic survival. We rarely spoke beyond necessary operational communication. Conversation was inefficient. The shift lasted 10 hours. 10 hours of monitoring, recording, maintaining. The recyclers hummed constantly, a sound that burrowed into your skull until you heard it even in sleep. By the time my shift ended at 16:30 hours, my eyes ached from staring at pressure gauges. My hands were stained with lubricant from valve maintenance, and my body was ready for the brief respite before tomorrow's identical shift. I would retrieve Selene from her educational facility. She would chatter about her lessons, about the other children, about the new prayer they had learned that day. I would listen with half my attention, the rest occupied with navigating the evening crowds as workers flooded corridors in their migration between day and night shifts. We would reach our HAB unit. Meritha would already be there, preparing the evening ration of nutrient paste. We would eat. We would spend perhaps an hour together, the 3 of us, in our 4 meter by 3 meter space. Then Selene would sleep. Meritha and I would share a few quiet words before exhaustion claimed us both. This was my life, unremarkable, insignificant, replicated in variations across billions of other lives throughout the Hive. We were components in a vast machine, performing our designated functions, replaceable and ultimately forgettable. The Imperium measures value by utility. I was useful. Therefore, I had value. It was enough. It had to be enough. What else was there? I did not hate my life. Hatred requires the belief that alternatives exist. I knew no alternatives. This was simply existence, as the Emperor ordained it. We served. We labored. We died. Others took our place. Humanity continued. In the grim darkness of the far future, this passes for meaning. 3 months before everything ended, I remember standing at the observation port on level 300. These ports existed at intervals throughout the Hive. Tiny reinforced windows that provided glimpses of the outside world. I had brought Selene there after her educational period. She had never seen outside the Hive. Few from the middle levels ever did. We pressed against the Plastech window, joining a dozen other citizens who had come to stare. The view showed the ash wastes, extending to the horizon. Gray-black desert of industrial fallout and chemical precipitation. The sky was a yellowish-brown smear, toxic clouds reflecting the glow of distant factorums. In the far distance, I could see Hive Secundus, a dark pillar reaching into the polluted heavens, its lights twinkling like stars too afraid to rise higher. "Is it beautiful?" Selene asked. I did not know how to answer. Beauty was not a word that applied to our world. But there was something in the vast emptiness of the wastes, in the terrible grandeur of the hive rising from desolation, that stirred something in my chest. Pride, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of human persistence. We had built these mountains of plasteel on a world that wanted us dead. We survived through sheer, stubborn will. "It is ours," I said finally. She nodded, not truly understanding but accepting my words as sufficient. We stood there for 20 more minutes, watching the wastes, before returning to our routines. I remember that moment now because it was the last time I felt connected to something larger than myself. The last time the hive felt like civilization rather than a tomb. 3 months later, the coughing began in the underhive, and everything I have described, this entire world of noise and smell and pressed-together humanity, began its march towards silence. The reports began arriving on a morning that seemed identical to every morning that had preceded it. I was performing routine maintenance on Recycler Unit 7, replacing a filtration membrane that had reached saturation capacity, when the data slate chimed with an incoming message from Central Atmospheric Command. This was unusual. Central rarely contacted individual stations directly. Communication flowed upward through reports, not downward through direct transmission. I wiped the lubricant from my hands and accessed the message. It was brief, clinical in its terminology, the way all Imperial communications are when discussing matters of life and death. Atmospheric Station 285-47G. Be advised. Quarantine protocols enacted levels 1 through 50. Suspected biological contaminant. Increase filtration monitoring. Report any anomalous readings immediately. The Emperor protects. I read it twice. Biological contaminant. In the underhive, this could mean anything. Toxic spills from chemical runoff, mutant plagues, spoiled food stores producing bacterial blooms. The underhive existed in a constant state of low-level crisis. Quarantine protocols were enacted monthly. My jurisdiction was level 285, nearly 235 levels above the affected zone. The recycler systems were segmented. Air from the underhive underwent additional scrubbing before entering middle hive circulation. Yet something in the message's terseness unsettled me. I noted it in my log and continued my work. 3 days later, Horvath arrived at the station looking worse than usual. His perpetual wheeze had intensified to a rattling cough that shook his entire frame. His face carried a grayish pallor beneath the grime of hive living. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the station's cool temperature. "You should report to a Medicae facility," I told him, watching him slump into his monitoring station. "For a cough?" He waved dismissively. "I have had this cough for 30 years. The air in this Emperor-forsaken hive could kill a plague victim." He laughed, which triggered another coughing fit. This one lasted nearly a minute. When it subsided, he spat into a waste receptacle. I saw blood in the phlegm. "Horvath." "That is blood." "Old lungs," he said. "Weak flesh. I will be fine after this shift." He was not fine. 6 hours into our shift, he collapsed at his station, simply stood, took 2 steps toward the recycler readouts, and fell. His body struck the metal deck with a sound I can still hear in the silence. Wet and final. Cassandra and I rushed to him, turned him over. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. Blood ran from his nose, his mouth, the corners of his eyes. His skin had gone from gray to pale white, like meat drained of color. I checked for a pulse. Found nothing. "Get Medicae," I told Cassandra. My voice was steady, calm, as if discovering a dead co-worker was routine. Perhaps it was. People died in the hive constantly. Age, accident, violence, despair. Death was as common as breathing. But this death felt different. The blood, the sudden collapse, the grayish pallor that had preceded it. The Medicae servitors arrived 30 minutes later, their movements precise and uncaring as they loaded Horvath's body onto a transport gurney. A tech priest accompanied them, his robes the red of the Adeptus Mechanicus, his face hidden behind a rebreather that gave his voice a mechanical rasp. "Cause of death?" I asked. The tech priest consulted a handheld auspex, its screen displaying data I could not read. "Preliminary scan indicates catastrophic hemorrhagic failure, multiple organ systems, rapid onset." He looked up at me, his augmetic eyes whirring as they focused. "Has this unit been to the lower levels recently?" "He worked here for 30 years. I do not know his movements outside duty hours." The tech priest nodded slowly. "All personnel in this station are to report for medical screening within 48 hours, by order of the Planetary Health Directorate." He handed me a data slate containing instructions, then departed with the servitors and Horvath's body. Cassandra stood in the corner of the station, her face pale. "The quarantine," she said quietly. "It is spreading." I wanted to reassure her. To say that Horvath's death was unrelated, coincidental, that the Underhive problems stayed in the Underhive as they always did. But I had read the preliminary scan data over the tech priest's shoulder. Hemorrhagic failure. The same terminology appeared in the atmospheric contamination reports from the lower levels. That evening, I did not tell Meritha about Horvath. There was no point in creating concern. Death was common. This was simply one more. I ate my evening ration with my family, listened to Selene describe her day, pretended everything was normal because it still was normal. One death did not unmake the world. The medical screening occurred 2 days later at Medicae Station 285A. I joined a line of perhaps 300 citizens, all waiting to be processed. The facility was understaffed, as all Medicae facilities were, operated by servitors and a handful of exhausted human staff who moved through examinations with mechanical efficiency. When my turn came, a Medicae orderly scanned me with an auspex similar to the one the tech priest had used. The device hummed against my chest, my throat, my forehead. The orderly studied the readout, his expression carefully neutral. "Elevated white blood cell count," he noted. "Consistent with immune response. No active infection detected. You are cleared for continued work." He made a notation on his data slate. "Report immediately if you develop respiratory symptoms. Coughing, difficulty breathing, bloody sputum. What exactly should I watch for?" The orderly hesitated. For a moment, the neutral expression cracked, revealing something beneath. "Concern, perhaps fear. The creeping pale," he said quietly. "That is what they are calling it in the lower levels. Victims develop a gray complexion. Then the cough begins. Then death follows within 72 hours. He looked at me directly. "There is no cure. Avoid crowds if possible. Maintain hygiene protocols. Pray to the Emperor for protection." I walked back to my HAB unit through corridors that suddenly felt more crowded, more threatening. Every cough I heard made me flinch. Every pale face seemed suspect. How many were already infected? How many would develop symptoms tomorrow, the next day? The creeping pale. Even the name carried menace. When I reached the HAB unit, Meritha was preparing the evening meal. Selene sat on her sleeping pallet, working through educational exercises on a battered data slate. Everything appeared normal, safe. I wanted to seal the door and never leave. To protect my family by simply refusing to acknowledge the threat growing in the levels below. "You look troubled," Meritha said, not looking up from the heating element. "A co-worker died, Horvath. You never met him. I am sorry." She said it automatically, the required response. Then she paused. "How did he die?" But I could lie, should lie. Instead, I told her the truth about the blood, the collapse, the medical screening, the name they were giving to the disease, spreading through the underhive. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "It will not reach us here. The underhive is always sick with something. This will burn itself out as these things do." I wanted to believe her. The underhive was separated from us by hundreds of levels, by kilometers of vertical distance, by quarantine protocols and sealed bulkheads. Surely the plague, if it truly was a plague, would be contained as plagues always were. The Imperium was efficient at containment, ruthless in its willingness to sacrifice the few for the many. But I had worked atmospheric regulation for 15 years. I understood how air moved through the hive. The recyclers pulled from all levels, scrubbed the contaminants, redistributed the breathable mixture throughout the structure. If the disease was airborne, if it could survive the filtration process, then vertical distance meant nothing. Everyone breathed the same air eventually. I did not share this thought with Meritha. The next week brought more deaths. Not in my immediate sector, but in adjacent areas. Level 2, 87. Level 2, 90. Level 2, 76. The Medicaid facilities began filling with victims displaying the same symptoms: gray skin, bloody cough, rapid death. The hemorrhaging was total. Victims bled from every orifice in their final hours: eyes, nose, mouth. Even their pores wept blood. The Planetary Health Directorate issued new protocols: mandatory reporting of respiratory symptoms, restrictions on movement between levels, increased Medicaid screenings for all workers. The voxcasters that broadcasted planetary news and imperial propaganda began including health advisories between the usual litanies of production quotas and exhortations to faithful service. "Citizens of Hive Primus Majoris," the broadcast said in the flat, emotionless voice of approved communication, "remain vigilant against biological threats. Report symptoms immediately. Maintain production quotas. The Emperor protects the faithful. Trust in imperial medicine and the guidance of the Adeptus Terra." But production quotas were not being maintained. Workers were dying or too sick to report to their assignments. Factories on the lower levels had gone silent. Food distribution centers were operating at reduced capacity. The hive's vast machinery of industry and survival was stuttering. I saw the first panic on level 288 while returning from my shift. A crowd had gathered at the transport hub, hundreds of citizens attempting to board the elevators that would carry them to the upper levels. Arbite's enforcers had established a cordon, their shock mauls drawn, their voices amplified through Vox speakers. "Return to your designated levels. Unauthorized vertical movement is prohibited. Compliance is mandatory. Return to your designated levels or face punitive action." The crowd surged forward anyway. Desperation overcomes fear of authority when death is the alternative. I watched from a safe distance as the Arbites opened fire, not with shock mauls but with stub guns and shotguns. The reports echoed through the transport hub like thunder. Bodies fell. Blood pooled on the metal deck. The crowd broke, screaming, running, trampling those who had fallen in their attempt to escape both plague and punishment. I stood frozen. I had seen violence before. The hive was never truly peaceful. But this was different. This was Imperial forces, killing Imperial citizens in wholesale fashion. The Arbites continued firing until the transport hub was clear, except for the dead and dying. 37 bodies by my count, perhaps more hidden beneath the mass of fallen humanity. One of the Arbites noticed me watching. He pointed his weapon in my direction. "Move along, citizen. Nothing to witness here. Return to your HAB unit. Curfew is now in effect for all levels." I moved along. Quickly, not running. Running would suggest guilt or panic, but walking with purposeful speed. Behind me, I heard the Arbites calling for disposal servitors to clear the bodies. That night, I moved Meritha and Selene to the atmospheric station. It was not authorized. Families were not permitted in work facilities, but the station had clean air, directly filtered, constantly monitored. If the plague was airborne, the station offered better protection than our HAB unit with its shared ventilation connecting to thousands of other units. Cassandra said nothing when she arrived for her shift and found my family camped in the corner of the station. She simply nodded and went about her work. Perhaps she understood. Perhaps she was too frightened to care about protocol violations. We established a new routine. Meritha and Selene stayed in the station during my shifts. When I was off duty, I would venture out to acquire food rations, necessary supplies, information about the plague's progression. The corridors were emptier now. People stayed in their HAB units when possible, venturing out only when absolutely necessary. The Voxcasters continued their broadcasts, but the tone had shifted. Less reassurance, more instruction. All citizens are required to remain in their designated living spaces, except for essential labor. Food rations will be delivered to HAB units. Violators of quarantine protocols will be executed on site. This is for the protection of all. The Emperor protects. 2 weeks after Horvath's death, the first mass die-off occurred. Levels 100 through 150 went silent over a 48-hour period. 30 billion people. The Vox channels from those levels simply stopped transmitting. Emergency response teams sent to investigate returned with reports of total mortality. Everyone dead. Bodies piled in corridors. Entire families dead in their HAB units, workers dead at their stations. The plague had moved through those levels like fire through dry wood. The planetary governor, Mark Helm, made a rare public address. His image appeared on every Vox screen throughout the Hive, his face composed into an expression of stern resolve. Citizens of Hive Primus Majoris, we face a biological threat of unprecedented scale. The lower levels have been lost. Quarantine bulkheads are being sealed to prevent further contamination. Those in the middle and upper Hive must remain vigilant. Maintain your posts. Continue your labors. The Adeptus Mechanicus is working to develop countermeasures. The Ecclesiarchy prays for the Emperor's intervention. We will survive this crisis, as humanity has survived every crisis. Through faith, through duty, through sacrifice. The transmission ended. I noticed he did not mention evacuation, did not speak of rescue for those trapped in the sealed lower levels. The imperial calculus was clear. Sacrifice the infected to save the uninfected. It was logical, efficient, monstrous. That night, I held Meritha close in the atmospheric station while Selene slept curled against her mother. We did not speak. What was there to say? Hope had become a luxury we could not afford. The plague continued its inexorable climb through the Hive levels. Level 90, Level 120, Level 155. Each day brought reports of new sectors going silent. The death toll climbed beyond comprehension. Billions dead, then tens of billions. The numbers lost meaning. How does one conceptualize 30 billion deaths? 40 billion? They became abstractions. Statistics rather than lives. I continued monitoring the atmospheric systems because it was all I knew how to do. The recyclers kept running. Air kept circulating. And with it, I now understood. The plague kept spreading. My work, my purpose, had become the vector of humanity's destruction. Meritha developed the cough on the 32nd day after Horvath's death. The sound of her coughing woke me. A wet, rattling hack that seemed to tear itself from her chest. I knew that sound. I had heard it from Horvath, from the citizens who had collapsed in corridors, from the Vox reports describing the dying in the lower levels. It was the sound of the creeping pale, claiming another victim. I sat up on the makeshift bedding we had arranged in the atmospheric station. The chronometer read, 300 hours. Meritha was bent over, one hand braced against the wall, the other covering her mouth as another coughing fit seized her. When it passed, she pulled her hand away. Even in the dim emergency lighting, I could see the blood on her palm. "Cassel," she said quietly. Her voice was hoarse, strained. "I am sorry. Sorry." As if she had chosen this, as if her body's betrayal was a moral failing, requiring apology. I moved to her side, placed my hand on her back. Her skin was hot through the thin fabric of her work clothes. Fever, another symptom. The disease progressed rapidly once symptoms appeared. 72 hours from first cough to death. That was the pattern established across billions of cases. Selene still slept in the corner, mercifully unaware. I wanted to keep her asleep, to preserve her innocence for a few more hours. But Meritha's coughing would wake her soon enough. "We need to get you to Medicae," I said, though I knew it was futile. The Medicae facilities were overwhelmed, operating beyond any reasonable capacity. And they had no cure, no treatment beyond palliative care. The plague killed everyone it infected. Always, without exception. "No," Meritha said firmly. "I will not spend my final hours in a facility surrounded by strangers. I will stay here, with you, with Selene." Another coughing fit interrupted her. More blood. The gray pallor was already beginning to show on her skin, a subtle discoloration that would intensify over the coming hours. I had no argument. She was right. The Medicae facilities offered nothing except a bed among the dying. Better to remain here, in the atmospheric station that had become our home, with what remained of our family. The next hours passed in a nightmare of slow-motion horror. Meritha's condition deteriorated with the methodical precision of a machine grinding toward inevitable failure. The cough worsened, coming more frequently, producing more blood with each episode. The gray discoloration spread across her skin like frost forming on metal. Her fever climbed. She began shivering despite the heat radiating from her body. Selene woke as dawn cycle began, the station's lights automatically brightening to simulate morning. She saw her mother immediately, saw the blood, the gray skin, the shaking. She was 8 years old. Old enough to understand what this meant. "Mama!" Her voice was small, frightened. Meritha tried to smile. The expression was ghastly on her graying face. "Come here, little star." She used her pet name for Selene, the one she had called her since birth. Selene hesitated, then moved to her mother's side. Meritha wrapped an arm around her, pulled her close despite the risk of transmission. What did risk matter now? I should have separated them, should have maintained quarantine protocols, but I could not, would not. If these were Meritha's final hours, she deserved to hold her daughter. I tried to work, to maintain the routine of monitoring the atmospheric systems, but my attention was divided, constantly drawn to Meritha and Selene, sitting together against the wall. Meritha spoke to our daughter in quiet tones, words I could not hear over the machinery. Perhaps she was offering comfort. Perhaps she was saying goodbye. Perhaps she was simply filling the time with sound because silence would make the waiting unbearable. By midday, Meritha could no longer sit upright. She lay on the bedding, her breathing labored and wet. The hemorrhaging had intensified. Blood ran from her nose in a continuous stream. Her eyes were bloodshot. The whites turned crimson. When she coughed now, the blood was black, thick with clotted tissue. Selene sat beside her, holding her hand. My daughter's face was blank, emotionless. Shock, I realized. She had retreated into herself, unable to process what was happening. I knelt beside them both, useless and helpless. There was nothing I could do, no action I could take. I could only bear witness. "Cassel," Meritha whispered. Her voice was barely audible. I leaned close. "Take care of her. Keep her safe." "I will," I promised, knowing it was a lie. The plague was still spreading, still climbing through the levels. We were all going to die. It was only a matter of when. Tell her I love her. When she is older, when she can understand, tell her I loved her more than anything. I will tell her. Meritha's eyes closed. Her breathing became irregular. Shallow breaths followed by long pauses, followed by desperate gasps. This was the end stage. I had read the medical reports, knew the progression. The body's organs were failing, drowning in internal hemorrhaging. Death was minutes away now, not hours, minutes. I pulled Selene into my lap, turned her face away from her mother. She did not resist, did not struggle, simply buried her face against my chest and remained silent. No crying, no sound at all. Children in the hive learned early that tears changed nothing. Meritha died at 14-20 hours, 38 hours after her first cough. Her final breath was a wet rattle that seemed to echo in the atmospheric station's confined space. Then silence. Her chest did not rise again. The fever heat began to fade from her skin almost immediately. I sat holding Selene for a long time. How long, I cannot say. Time lost meaning in that moment. Eventually, I gently moved Selene aside and approached Meritha's body. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. Blood had pooled beneath her, dark and congealing. I closed her eyes, an old ritual from before the hive, before the Imperium, a gesture of respect for the dead. I should have reported her death, should have called for disposal servitors to remove the body. But I could not bear the thought of her corpse being thrown into the reclamation furnaces with thousands of others, reduced to ash and chemical components without ceremony or acknowledgement. So I wrapped her in blankets and placed her in the corner of the station, away from the operational area. I would deal with it later, after I figured out how to continue existing in a world without her. Cassandra arrived for the night shift at 1800 hours. She saw the wrapped body immediately, saw Selene sitting motionless against the wall, saw my face, and understood everything without asking. "I am sorry, Cassel," she said quietly. "Thank you." The words were automatic, meaningless. What was sorrow measured against 70 billion deaths? What was one more loss? "My family is dead too," Cassandra said after a moment. "My parents, my brother, all of them developed symptoms within days of each other. All dead now." She said it without emotion, stating facts. "I think everyone is going to die. Everyone except perhaps us. I do not know why we are not sick yet. Maybe we are immune. Maybe we are just lucky. Maybe we will develop symptoms tomorrow." "It does not matter," I said. And it did not. Survival meant nothing if everyone else was dead. What was the point of immunity in a dead world? We worked our shift in silence. Selene remained motionless in her corner, staring at nothing. I wanted to comfort her, but I had no comfort to offer. What could I say? Your mother is dead. Most of humanity is dead. We will probably die too. These were not words that offered solace. The Vox channels were becoming sporadic. Many levels no longer transmitted. The silence was spreading upward through the hive as surely as the plague. Level 1, 80. Level 2, 110. Level 2, 40. Each day brought new sectors going dark. The hive was dying from the bottom up. On the second day after Meritha's death, I ventured out to acquire food rations. The corridors were nearly empty. Most citizens remained sealed in their hab units, either already dead or waiting to die. The few I encountered moved quickly, faces covered with improvised masks, eyes wide with fear. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. We were all ghosts haunting the hive's empty spaces. The food distribution center for Sector 47 Gamma was closed, its security shutters locked. A notice had been posted. Distribution suspended due to personnel shortage. Citizens are advised to access emergency rations. The Emperor protects. Emergency rations were stored in sealed lockers throughout each sector, meant for crisis situations. This qualified. I broke open a locker using a maintenance tool. Inside were boxes of compressed nutrient blocks, water purification tablets, basic medical supplies. I took what I could carry and returned to the atmospheric station. Selene had not moved, had not eaten, had not spoken since her mother's death. "You need to eat," I told her, offering a nutrient block. She looked at it, looked at me, then turned her face away. "Selene, you will die if you do not eat." "Everyone is dying anyway," she said. Her voice was flat, empty. "Mama died. Everyone will die. What difference does eating make?" I had no answer. She was right. The logic was sound. But I forced her to eat anyway, breaking small pieces of the nutrient block and making her chew, making her swallow. Because giving up meant letting the plague win without fighting. Because I refused to let my daughter starve while I still lived. The third day brought new horror. Selene developed the cough. I heard it in the early morning hours. That same wet rattle that had announced Meritha's death sentence. Selene sat up, confused, then coughed into her hand. When she pulled it away, blood stained her palm. She looked at me, and for the first time since her mother's death, I saw emotion on her face. Fear. Pure, absolute fear. "Papa," she whispered, "I do not want to die." The words broke something inside me. Some final reserve of emotional control that had kept me functional through the past days. I pulled her into my arms, held her close, and for the first time since the plague began, I wept. Not quiet tears, but wrenching sobs that shook my entire body, because my daughter was dying. Because I could do nothing to save her. Because the universe was cruel and arbitrary, and the emperor we prayed to either could not or would not protect us. "I am sorry," I said into her hair. "I am so sorry. It is not your fault, Papa." Her voice was muffled against my chest. "You tried. You kept us safe as long as you could. But I had not kept them safe. I had moved them to the atmospheric station, thinking the filtered air would protect them. Instead, I had likely exposed them to higher concentrations of the pathogen. The recyclers pulled air from every level, concentrated it, processed it. If the plague was airborne, the station was probably one of the worst places to shelter. My attempt to protect my family had killed them. Selene's condition progressed faster than her mother's. Perhaps because she was smaller, her body less able to fight the infection. Perhaps because she was a child and children died faster from everything in the hive. Within 12 hours, she was gray-skinned and bleeding. Within 24 hours, she could no longer stand. Within 36 hours, she was unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. I held her the entire time, did not sleep, did not eat, simply held my dying daughter and watched the life drain from her small body. Cassandra tried to convince me to rest, to let her watch over Selene. I refused. These were my daughter's final hours. I would not miss them, would not delegate them to another. Selene died without regaining consciousness, 42 hours after her first cough. One moment she was breathing, the next she was not. The transition was so subtle I almost missed it. Just a cessation of movement, a final relaxation of her muscles. Then, stillness. I sat holding her body long after it had grown cold. Eventually, Cassandra gently took Selene from my arms and wrapped her in blankets beside her mother. Two bodies, now in the corner of the atmospheric station. My entire family. Everyone I had loved. Dead. I should have felt something. Grief, rage, despair. But there was only emptiness, a vast, hollow void where emotion should have been. The plague had not infected my body, but it had killed something inside me regardless. Whatever part of a human being feels and connects and cares had been excised as surely as if cut away with a surgeon's blade. The hive continued its death spiral around me. The Vox channels reported Level 270 going silent, Level 2 93, Level 3 115. The plague was now above me. I was surrounded on all sides by death, by empty sectors and silent corridors. The population estimates updated daily, though who was doing the counting I could not imagine. 87 billion, 70 billion, 60 billion, 50 billion. Numbers, just numbers. Each one representing countless individuals with names and lives and families. But they were dead now, and the living had no time to mourn. We were too busy preparing for our own deaths. I discovered why I was not infected during a rare transmission from the Adeptus Mechanicus research facilities in the upper spire. A tech priest appeared on the Vox screens, his augmented face emotionless behind its rebreather. Preliminary analysis of the pathogen designated creeping pale indicates genetic targeting mechanisms, he stated in his mechanical rasp. Approximately 0.001% of the population demonstrates natural immunity due to genetic variants. These individuals cannot be infected and cannot transmit the disease. They are statistically irrelevant to population survival, but may serve as subjects for continued study should they survive the societal collapse. 0.001%. In a population of 87 billion, that meant roughly 870,000 people with natural immunity, scattered across 500 levels, most probably already dead from starvation, violence, or suicide. Being immune to the plague meant nothing when the infrastructure supporting life was collapsing. I was one of the immune. A genetic accident had spared me while killing everyone I loved. The knowledge brought no comfort, only bitter irony. I would survive to witness the end, to see everyone die while I remained untouched by the disease. It felt like punishment. On the 45th day after the plague's first appearance in the Underhive, the power began failing. Not completely, but in sections. Level 260 went dark for 6 hours. Level 290 lost power permanently. The generatorum facilities were unmanned, their operators dead or fled. The ancient reactors continued running on automated systems, but without maintenance, they would eventually fail. When the power failed, the atmospheric recyclers would stop. The air would go stale, then toxic. Everyone remaining would suffocate in the darkness. Perhaps that would be a mercy. Quicker than the plague. Less painful than starvation. I continued monitoring the recyclers in my sector because I had nothing else to do. Cassandra still arrived for her shifts, though we barely spoke. What was there to say? We performed our duties out of habit, maintaining systems for a population that no longer existed. On the 50th day, Cassandra did not arrive for her shift. I waited 6 hours, then went to her hab unit. The door was unsealed. Inside, I found her body hanging from a pipe, a length of cable around her neck. She had left no note, no explanation. None was needed. I cut her down and wrapped her body with the same blankets I had used for Meritha and Selene. 3 bodies, now in the atmospheric station. I had become a curator of the dead. The Vox channels went silent on the 68th day. No more transmissions, no more updates, no more reassurances that the Emperor protected, just static and the hum of machinery. The silence had finally consumed even the voice of imperial authority. I was alone, truly, completely alone. In a hive built for 87 billion people, I was the last one still breathing. The weight of that realization was crushing, absolute. I stood in the atmospheric station, surrounded by the dead, and understood that I was the sole witness to humanity's extinction in Hive Primus Majoris. The Emperor had not protected us. Prayer had not saved us. Duty had not spared us. We had died anyway, billions upon billions, until only I remained. One man in a vertical tomb 200 kilometers tall. The last living soul in a city of the dead. And I had no idea what to do with that survival. Act 5. The silence descends. The first thing you notice about true silence is that it is not actually silent. The hive still hummed with machine noise, ventilation systems cycling air through empty corridors, generatorum turbines spinning in unmanned facilities, water pumps forcing liquid through pipes no one would ever use again. The infrastructure continued its automated functions, indifferent to the absence of humanity. But the human noise was gone. All of it. The voices, the footsteps, the crying children, the shouting vendors, the prayers, the arguments, the laughter, gone. I had lived my entire life immersed in the roar of 87 billion people existing in pressed-together proximity. The noise had been omnipresent, inescapable, so constant that it became invisible. Background texture to every moment of existence. Now it was gone, and the absence was a physical presence. The silence pressed against my eardrums like atmospheric pressure. It had weight. It had texture. It was suffocating. I began talking to myself constantly, narrating my actions as I performed them, commenting on the recycler readouts, describing what I saw as I moved through the station. Anything to hear a human voice, even if it was my own. The alternative was surrendering to the silence, letting it swallow me completely. I feared that if I stopped speaking, I would forget how. That my voice would atrophy from disuse until I became as mute as the corpses surrounding me. Pressure gauge on Recycler Unit 3 shows nominal readings, I would say aloud to no one. Temperature stable. Filtration membranes at 67% capacity, within acceptable parameters. Then I would move to the next unit and repeat the process. Speaking. Always speaking. The sound of my voice echoing off metal walls was the only proof I still existed. The Vox channels remained silent. I checked them obsessively, cycling through every frequency, searching for any transmission, any voice that might indicate another survivor. I found nothing. Just static. The white noise hiss of dead channels stretching across the electromagnetic spectrum. Sometimes I would leave a channel open while I worked, letting the static play as a substitute for human sound. It was not the same, but it was something. An auditory texture that filled the oppressive quiet. Sleep became difficult. Nightmares plagued every attempt at rest. I would dream of drowning in corpses, of being buried alive beneath billions of dead bodies. I would dream of Meritha and Selene, their gray faces leaning close, blood running from their eyes, asking why I had not saved them. I would dream of the corridors filling with bodies until there was no room to move, until I was crushed beneath the weight of humanity's death. I would wake, gasping, covered in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The station felt too small, claustrophobic. I was sharing 15 square meters with 3 corpses. The bodies had begun to decay despite the cool temperature. The smell was becoming unbearable. I knew I needed to move them, to dispose of them properly. But I could not. They were all I had left. The only physical evidence that I had once had a family, that I had once been part of something larger than myself. Removing them felt like betrayal. Instead, I sealed them in an unused storage alcove, wrapping the bodies in every blanket I could find and closing the access panel. It was not burial, not really, but it removed them from sight, contained the smell somewhat. I told myself I would give them proper rites later, when I had time, when I could face it. The lies we tell ourselves to function. On the 73rd day, I forced myself to explore beyond the atmospheric station. I had been avoiding it, staying in the familiar confines of my workplace. But I needed to know the extent of the death. Needed to understand what had become of the hive, so I equipped myself with a portable lumen and ventured into the corridors of Level 285. The silence in the corridors was deeper than in the station, more complete. My footsteps echoed with unnatural clarity, the sound bouncing off metal walls and returning distorted. I passed hab units with unsealed doors. Inside, families lay dead where they had fallen, parents and children together in final embrace. Some had died peacefully, the plague taking them in sleep. Others showed signs of violent death throes, blood splattered on walls, bodies contorted in agony. I documented what I found on a data slate, recording images and observations. Some instinct drove me to preserve this information, to create a record of what had happened. Perhaps I believed someone would eventually find it. Perhaps I simply needed a purpose, any purpose, to justify continued existence. Sector 47 Gamma had housed approximately 7 million people. I estimated 99% were dead in their HAB units. The remaining 1% had likely died elsewhere or had been among the early casualties whose bodies were removed to reclamation facilities before the infrastructure collapsed. 7 million people in my sector alone. All dead, all silent. I moved through adjacent sectors, finding the same tableau of death repeated endlessly. HAB blocks full of corpses. Market streets where vendors lay collapsed beside their goods. Medicae facilities overflowing with bodies, the staff dead alongside their patients. Ecclesiarchy chapels where the faithful had died mid-prayer, their hands still clasped in supplication to an emperor who had not answered. The scale became overwhelming. I stopped counting after the first 1,000 corpses. The numbers lost meaning. Each body was an individual tragedy, but there were too many to process individually. They became a mass, an undifferentiated sea of death. I began to understand why imperial authorities spoke of populations in billions without pause. At a certain scale, individual lives ceased to register. You could not mourn billions. The mind could not contain that much grief. On level 290, I found evidence of violence. A corridor littered with shell casings and impact craters. Dried blood painted across walls in arterial sprays. This was where Arbites had opened fire on fleeing citizens. The bodies were still here, dozens of them, mummifying in the dry, recycled air. Men, women, children, all shot in the back as they ran. Their only crime was seeking survival. I stood among the dead and felt something crack inside my chest. Not grief. I had exhausted grief. This was rage. Pure, incandescent rage at the Imperium that had killed these people. Not the plague. The Imperium. The system that valued order over life, that shot its own citizens for the crime of fear, that sealed levels and left billions to die rather than attempt evacuation or treatment. The Emperor protects, I said aloud to the corpses, my voice bitter with sarcasm. He protects nothing. He watches while we die and does nothing. Billions dead, and he sits on his golden throne, silent and uncaring. The words felt like heresy. They were heresy. But who would punish me? The Arbites were dead. The Ecclesiarchy was dead. The Inquisition would never hear my blasphemy. I was beyond judgment, beyond law. The sole survivor of a dead world. I could curse the Emperor 1,000 times and face no consequence except my own guilt. I did not curse him again, not because I feared punishment, but because the rage exhausted itself as quickly as it had appeared. Anger required energy I no longer possessed. I returned to the atmospheric station and resumed my routine. Monitor the recyclers, record the readings, speak aloud to prevent silence from claiming my voice. Exist without purpose. Wait without expectation. The Vox channels came alive on the 81st day. I was performing maintenance on Recycler Unit 5 when I heard it. A voice, faint, distorted by static, but unmistakably human. I dropped my tools and lunged for the Vox terminal, adjusting frequencies to clarify the signal. Repeat. This is Medicae Station 427 on level 460. Is anyone receiving this transmission? Is anyone still alive? Please respond. A survivor. In the upper spire, my hands shook as I activated the transmission function. This is Atmospheric Station 28547G. I receive you. I am alive. Are there others? Static filled the silence. Had they heard me? Had my transmission failed? Then the voice returned, stronger now. filled with desperate relief. Emperor be praised. I thought I was alone. There are 6 of us here. Medical staff. We sealed ourselves in a clean room when the plague reached our level. Are there others with you? No, I said. My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. I am alone. Everyone in my sector is dead. Everyone. Another pause. When the voice returned, the relief had faded. It is the same here. Level 460 is dead except for us. We have been listening to the Vox channels for weeks. You are the first response we have received. We spoke for 2 hours. They told me their story. 6 Medicae staff who had recognized the plague's progression early and sealed themselves in a sterile research facility. They had food, water, power. They were safe for now. But they were trapped. The surrounding levels were dead. The transit systems were non-functional. They could not descend through hundreds of kilometers of corpse-filled corridors. I told them about my sector, about the atmospheric station, about my family, about witnessing the death of 87 billion people while remaining untouched by the disease that killed them. They listened without interrupting. When I finished, one of them, a woman named Valeria, spoke. We believe the immunity is genetic, rare but real. You are not the only one. There must be others scattered throughout the hive. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. But finding them would be impossible. The hive is too large. Too dead. What do we do? I asked. The question felt absurd. What could we do? We were 7 people in a structure designed for billions. 7 voices in an empty tomb. We survive, Valeria said. We maintain our facilities. We wait. Perhaps Imperial forces will come eventually. Perhaps they will evacuate the survivors. Or perhaps we simply survive as long as we can and then die like everyone else. But we survive today. That is all we can do. We agreed to maintain daily Vox contact, to share information and resources, to remind each other that we were not completely alone. It was a small comfort. 6 people hundreds of kilometers above me might as well have been on a different planet. But knowing they existed eased the crushing weight of isolation slightly. The next day, I attempted to reach them physically. I would climb to level 460, meet the other survivors, find community in shared horror. The attempt failed before it truly began. The transit systems were dead. The elevators frozen. The stairwells were accessible, but climbing 400 kilometers vertically through corpse-filled passages was beyond my capability. I made it to level 300 before exhaustion forced me back. The Vox contact continued daily. We would speak for an hour each evening, sharing observations, discussing survival strategies, simply filling time with human voices. On the 94th day, one of the Medicae staff, a man named Horvath, his name a cruel coincidence with my dead co-worker, developed symptoms. His voice on the Vox was calm, accepting. It seems the clean room was not as sealed as we believed. Or perhaps I was exposed before we entered. It does not matter now. I have maybe 2 days remaining. He died 36 hours later. Valeria reported his death with clinical detachment, but I could hear the grief beneath her professional tone. 6 survivors had become 5. They sealed his body in a storage freezer to prevent contamination. On the 108th day, 2 more developed symptoms. Sisters named Kara and Melon. They died within hours of each other. On the 110th day, 5 survivors became 3. Valeria, a tech priest named Ortho, and an apothecary named Then. On the 121st day, the power failed on level 460. Ortho managed to restore partial function through emergency generators, but the clean room's environmental seals were compromised. Then developed symptoms that night. He died quietly, Valeria holding his hand through the final hemorrhaging. On the 135th day, Ortho's voice came through the Vox. Valeria developed symptoms this morning. She is progressing rapidly. I do not think she will survive the day. I am sorry, I said. Inadequate words, meaningless words. But what else was there? I will be alone after she dies, Ortho said. His voice carried the mechanical rasp of augmetics. But beneath it, I heard very human fear. I do not know if I can bear it. The solitude, the silence. You can. I lied. You will. Because what choice do we have? Valeria died that afternoon. Ortho transmitted her final words. Tell Cassel, he is not alone. Tell him we existed. Tell him we mattered. I wept when I heard that. Not for Valeria specifically, though her death grieved me. I wept for all of it. For the billions dead. For the impossible weight of being witness to extinction. For the loneliness of surviving what should have killed everyone. Ortho continued transmitting for 3 more days. His messages became increasingly erratic, disjointed. He spoke of hallucinations, of seeing the dead moving through corridors, of hearing voices that could not exist. On the 138th day, his transmission was a single sentence. I cannot do this anymore. Then silence. I called for him repeatedly, received no response. I never learned if he died from the plague or by his own hand. Either way, 7 survivors had become 1. I was alone again. Completely alone. The Vox channels returned to static. I cycled through every frequency obsessively, searching for any voice. Found nothing. If other immune survivors existed, they were not transmitting. Perhaps they had no equipment. Perhaps they had died from other causes. Perhaps they were as silent as the corpses, waiting for death in solitude. I resumed speaking to myself, narrating my actions, commenting on recycler readings, describing the station's environment in exhaustive detail. Anything to hear human speech. My voice became my only companion. Sometimes I would have conversations with myself, playing both parts, asking questions and answering them. It was a symptom of developing madness. I knew this. I did not care. The Hive had become a monument to death, a vertical graveyard 200 kilometers tall, housing 87 billion corpses, and I was its sole caretaker, the last living soul wandering empty corridors, documenting the dead, maintaining systems that served no one. I had become a ghost, haunting my own life, neither fully alive nor properly dead, suspended in the silence between existence and oblivion. And the silence continued to grow deeper, heavier, more absolute with each passing day. The first month of true solitude taught me that human beings are not designed for absolute isolation. We are social creatures at our core, shaped by millennia of tribal existence, of family units, of community bonds. Remove all social contact, and the mind begins to decay. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, like metal corroding in acid. The edges of sanity soften and blur until you can no longer distinguish between what is real and what is hallucination. I established a routine to combat this decay. Routine was structure. Structure was sanity. I woke at 0600 hours each day, triggered by the atmospheric station's chronometer. I would consume a nutrient block and water from the recyclers, forcing myself to eat despite having no appetite. Then, I would perform my duties, monitor the recycler units, record the readings, file reports that no one would ever read, maintain the equipment. The work took approximately 4 hours of the day. The remaining 20 hours were the challenge. Empty time that needed to be filled with purpose, or else the silence would consume me completely. So I created tasks. I began documenting everything I could find in the surrounding sectors. Every corpse, every hab unit, every detail of how the plague had killed and where the bodies lay. I recorded it all on data slates, creating a comprehensive record of death. The work was grim, horrifying in its repetition, but it gave me purpose. Someone needed to remember these people. Someone needed to bear witness. I explored methodically, sector by sector, level by level. Each day I would venture into a new area, document what I found, then return to the atmospheric station before darkness made navigation too difficult. The portable lumen I carried cast harsh shadows that transformed familiar corridors into alien landscapes. Every shadow seemed to move at the edge of vision, every sound, and there were many sounds in the empty hive, made me flinch. The sounds were the worst part. The hive's infrastructure continued operating on automated systems, creating an orchestra of mechanical noise. Pipes creaking as temperature differentials stressed the metal. Ventilation fans engaging and disengaging on timed cycles. Servitors marching their programmed routes, stepping over corpses without acknowledgement. Once I heard what sounded like footsteps behind me in a corridor. I spun, lumen raised, certain I would see another survivor. There was nothing, just empty corridor and my own desperate imagination. I began talking to the corpses. Not constantly, but sometimes. When I found a body that seemed somehow more tragic than the others. A child clutching a worn toy. An elderly couple who had died holding hands. A worker who had collapsed at his station, his final recorded actions still displayed on his terminal. I would tell them I was sorry, that I would remember them, that their deaths mattered. It was absurd. They could not hear me, but speaking to them felt necessary. A ritual acknowledgement of their humanity. Food was not a concern. The hive had been provisioned to feed 87 billion people. Emergency rations were stored throughout every sector. I had access to enough compressed nutrient blocks and purified water to survive for decades, perhaps centuries if I rationed carefully. But survival was not truly about food. It was about maintaining the will to continue existing when existence had lost all purpose. Water came from the atmospheric recyclers, the same systems I maintained. I tried not to think about what was being recycled. The recyclers pulled moisture from the air throughout the hive. That air had passed over billions of decomposing corpses. The water I drank had been sweat and blood and tears. It had been part of the dead. The filtration process was thorough, removing all biological contaminants. The water was chemically pure, but knowing its origin made every drink feel like consumption of the dead, like becoming a tomb that processed corpses into continued life. Sleep remained difficult. The nightmares intensified with each passing week. I would dream that everyone was still alive, that I would return to the atmospheric station and find Meritha preparing nutrient paste, Selene working through her educational exercises, Horvath and Cassandra arriving for their shifts. Everything normal again. Then I would wake to silence and emptiness and the crushing reality that they were all dead. These dreams were worse than the nightmares of violence and death. Hope, even false hope experienced in dreams, made waking unbearable. I tried adjusting my sleep schedule to avoid the nightmares, sleeping in short bursts rather than extended periods, staying awake for 30 hours, then sleeping for 6. Nothing helped. The dreams came regardless. So I began using stimulants from Medicaid supply caches, chemical wakefulness that let me avoid sleep for days at a time. But eventually, exhaustion would overwhelm even the stimulants, and I would collapse into sleep so deep that nightmares could not penetrate. I would wake disoriented, unsure of how much time had passed, my body aching from lying on metal deck plating. On the 162nd day, I found another immune survivor. Or rather, I found what they had left behind. Level 267, HAB Unit 983,201A. The door was marked with writing. Words scratched into the metal with some sharp implement. I am the last. I have survived while everyone died. I cannot bear the weight of their absence. The Emperor has abandoned us. There is no point in continuing. Forgive me. Inside the HAB unit, a body hung from a pipe. A man, perhaps 40 years old, dead for weeks by the state of decomposition. He had been immune like me, had survived the plague, had witnessed the same horror, and had chosen death over continued survival. I cut him down and wrapped his body with the same care I had shown my family. I did not judge his choice. I understood it completely. Over the next weeks, I found 6 more suicides, all immune survivors, all dead by their own hand. Hanging, opened veins, poison. One who had simply walked off the edge of a transit platform and fallen hundreds of meters. They had left notes, scratched on walls or recorded on data slates. The words varied, but the sentiment was universal. I cannot bear the silence. Everyone is gone. There is no point. I am so alone. I collected their final words, adding them to my growing archive of the dead. Each suicide was a data point, a measurement of how long human sanity could survive in absolute isolation. Most had lasted between 60 and 100 days before choosing death. I had now survived 170 days. I was an outlier, an anomaly, or perhaps simply more stubborn, more willing to endure meaningless existence because the alternative required action I could not bring myself to take. I stood at the edge of the transit platform on level 285 for 3 hours one evening, looking down into the vertical shaft that descended hundreds of levels. It would be easy. One step. Gravity would do the rest. Death would be instant. No pain. No prolonged suffering. Just cessation. The silence would finally end because I would no longer be present to hear it. But I could not make myself step forward. Some instinct for survival, programmed at a level deeper than conscious thought, kept my feet planted. Or perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was the archive I was building. The record of the dead. Someone needed to preserve their memory if I died. If all the immune survivors chose death, then 87 billion people would have died without witness, without acknowledgement. They would be erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed. So I stepped back from the edge, returned to the atmospheric station, resumed my work. Document the dead, maintain the systems, speak aloud to prevent silence from claiming my voice, exist without purpose but with stubborn persistence. Because what else was there? I began creating a shrine in the atmospheric station. It started simply. I found a hololithic projector in an abandoned administrative office, brought it to the station, began displaying images of the dead. I would recover identity cards from corpses, scan the hololithic images embedded in them, add them to the projector's memory. Faces appeared on the station's walls. Thousands of faces, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Names beneath each image, designations, evidence that they had existed. The shrine grew to consume nearly half the station's available wall space, faces staring out from every surface. Men, women, children, workers, officials, priests, the high and the low, all equal in death, all preserved in hololithic memory. I would stand before the shrine each evening and speak to them, tell them about my day, about the sectors I had explored, about the other dead I had found. It was madness, obvious madness, but it gave me something, a connection, however false, to humanity, a reason to continue beyond simple biological persistence. I added my family to the shrine, Meritha and Selene, their faces among the thousands. I would speak to them specifically some nights, tell them I missed them, that I was sorry I had not protected them, that I hoped wherever they were, if there was anywhere beyond death, they were together and at peace. I did not believe in the imperial cult's promises of the emperor's embrace after death, but I wanted to believe my family had gone somewhere, that they were more than simply biological processes that had ceased. The maintenance of the atmospheric systems became ritual rather than necessity. The recyclers continued operating with minimal intervention. The automated systems were robust, designed to function for decades without human oversight. But I performed my duties regardless. checked the gauges, replaced filtration membranes on schedule, lubricated moving parts, filed maintenance reports in triplicate even though no one would ever read them. The ritual provided structure. Structure provided sanity, or the appearance of sanity. At this point, the distinction had become meaningless. On the 200th day, I completed my documentation of level 285. Every corpse accounted for, every HAB unit recorded, every detail preserved in data slate memory. 7 million deaths reduced to information, to names and numbers and hololithic images. It felt insufficient, disrespectful even. These had been lives, people with hopes and fears and loves and hates, and I had reduced them to data entries. But what else could I do? I could not remember 7 million individuals, could not honor each one separately. This was the only memorial possible. Better than nothing. Better than being forgotten entirely. I expanded my exploration to adjacent sectors. Level 286, level 284. The death was identical everywhere. Billions of corpses in various states of decay. Some had mummified in the dry air, skin drawn tight over bones, features preserved in expressions of final agony. Others had decomposed more completely, reduced to skeletal remains and stains on HAB unit floors. The smell varied by sector. Some areas were relatively tolerable, the bodies desiccated beyond the point of producing strong odors. Other sectors were vile, the stench of decay so thick it penetrated even the rebreather mask I had begun wearing. I found more evidence of violence. Not just Arbeitsshootings, but civilian violence. Gangs had formed in the final days, seizing food stores, fighting over resources that would ultimately prove worthless. Bodies bore signs of blade wounds, blunt trauma, burn marks. People had killed each other even as the plague killed everyone. Fear and desperation had overwhelmed social bonds. Humanity at its worst, revealed when survival seemed impossible and civilization's veneer cracked. But I also found evidence of compassion. Families who had died together, holding each other. Communities that had gathered in chapel spaces to pray together in their final hours. Workers who had remained at their posts until death claimed them, maintaining critical systems so others might survive a few hours longer. Humanity, at its best, revealed in the same circumstances. We were capable of both cruelty and kindness. The plague had not changed that. It had simply revealed what had always been present. My conversations with myself became more elaborate. I would assign different voices to different aspects of my personality. Cassel, the technician, who focused on maintaining the atmospheric systems. Cassel, the archivist, who documented the dead. Cassel, the survivor, who focused on basic needs like food and water. Cassel, the mourner, who grieved for the lost billions. They would debate each other, argue about priorities, discuss philosophical questions about meaning and purpose. I knew they were all me, knew I was fragmenting under the weight of isolation. But the conversations filled time and provided the illusion of social interaction. On the 230th day, I realized I had not looked at my own reflection in weeks. I found a mirror in an abandoned HAB unit and studied the face staring back. I barely recognized it. My hair had grown long, unkempt. My face was gaunt, cheekbones prominent beneath thin skin. My eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles. I looked sick, despite being immune. Malnutrition and stress had wasted my body. I looked like the corpses I documented daily. A walking dead man who had not yet realized he should lie down. I began forcing myself to eat more, to maintain basic hygiene, to preserve my physical body even as my mental state deteriorated. Because the archive was not complete. There were still sectors to document, still millions of dead who deserved to be remembered. I had to survive long enough to finish the work. That became my purpose. Not survival for its own sake, but survival in service to memory, to bearing witness, to ensuring that 87 billion deaths were not simply erased by silence and time. The shrine continued to grow. I added technical specifications now, details about how the plague had spread, mortality rates by level and sector, timelines of the collapse, medical data about the pathogen, everything I could recover from abandoned terminals and data stores. The atmospheric station became part archive, part memorial, part obsessive documentation of extinction. Future generations, if any existed, would find this place and know what had happened, would see the faces and read the names and understand the scale of death. That was my gift to the dead. The only thing I could offer them: memory. And in serving that purpose, in dedicating myself to bearing witness, I found something resembling peace, not happiness. Happiness was impossible in a tomb, but a kind of grim acceptance. This was my role. The last living soul in Hive Primus Majoris, the keeper of memory, the witness to extinction. I would survive as long as my body allowed, and I would document everything. And when I finally died, the archive would remain. A testament, a warning, a memorial. The dead deserved nothing less. And I, by accident of genetics, by the cruel lottery of immunity, had been chosen to provide it. On the 247th day, I decided to descend. The decision came suddenly, without prolonged consideration. I had documented the middle hive sectors surrounding my station. I had created memorials for millions, but I had avoided the lower levels, the underhive where the plague had originated, the foundational strata where 27 billion people had lived and died in darkness. If I was to be a complete witness, I needed to see where it had begun. The descent would be dangerous. The lower levels had lost power weeks before the middle hive. The air quality would be questionable, despite my atmospheric systems continuing to function. The structural integrity of the oldest sections was always suspect, even before the plague. But danger had become meaningless. What could kill me that was worse than the slow psychological death of isolation? I prepared methodically. Packed supplies, multiple portable lumens, rebreather equipment, nutrient blocks and water, a recording device to document what I found. I left a message in the atmospheric station, recorded on data slate, explaining my intentions. If I did not return, if I died in the descent, at least there would be a record of my final actions. The stairwells provided the only access between levels now that the transit systems had failed. These were maintenance passages, narrow and steep, designed for emergency use rather than regular traffic. I began at level 285 and descended into darkness. The portable lumen cast a circle of harsh white light that pushed back shadows but created new ones. Every step echoed. The sound bounced off metal walls and returned distorted, transformed into phantom footsteps that seemed to follow me. Level 250 showed the first signs of major structural failure. Sections of ceiling had collapsed, blocking corridors with debris. Water had leaked from burst pipes, creating pools of stagnant liquid that reflected my lumen like dark mirrors. The bodies here were in worse condition than those above. The heat from failing environmental systems had accelerated decomposition. Some corpses were barely recognizable as human, reduced to liquefied tissue and bone. The smell was vile beyond description. Even through the rebreather, the stench penetrated, sweet and rotten and chemical all at once. The HAB units on level 250 were smaller than those in my sector. Families had lived in spaces barely large enough to lie down. Privacy had been non-existent. Neighbors had lived pressed against each other, sharing walls so thin that every sound, every conversation, every moment of existence was audible to those surrounding them. And they had died the same way. Pressed together, families piled in corners, neighbors dead in each other's arms. The intimacy of hive life had continued even in death. I documented everything, recorded images, noted observations, added names to my archive when I could recover identification. The work was mechanical, emotionless. I had become efficient at processing death, 7 million corpses had numbed me to individual tragedy. These were simply more data points, more faces for the shrine, more names for the memorial. Level 200 marked a transition. The architecture changed. The middle hive's relative organization gave way to the chaotic construction of lower levels. Corridors branched at odd angles. Ceilings varied in height from 3 meters to barely enough clearance to crawl. Entire sections had been built without apparent planning, added as population pressure demanded more space. It was a maze of metal and rockreat, impossible to navigate without guidance systems. The bodies here told stories of the plague's progression. This was where the die-off had begun, where 30 billion people had gone silent over 2 days. The corpses were older, more thoroughly decomposed. Many had been partially consumed by vermin before the vermin themselves died. Rats lay dead beside the humans they had been feeding on. Insects had swarmed the bodies, then died in piles beneath them. The plague had killed indiscriminately every living thing that breathed the tainted air. I found a factorum district on level 170, manufacturing facilities that had produced components for weapons, armor, equipment. The production lines had frozen mid-operation. Half-assembled bolter components lay on conveyor belts. Servitors stood motionless at their stations, their biological components dead, their mechanical parts inert. Human workers had collapsed at their posts, tools still in their hands. They had worked until the moment death claimed them, duty fulfilled to the absolute end. The foreman's office contained records, production quotas, shift schedules, disciplinary reports for workers who had failed to meet standards. The final entry was dated 3 days before I estimated this level had gone silent. Production efficiency declining due to worker illness. Requesting Medicaid intervention and replacement personnel. Quota shortfall unacceptable. The foreman had been more concerned with production than the plague killing his workers. The imperial mindset distilled to its essence. Production over life, duty over survival. Level 150 brought the first evidence that the plague had been artificial. I found it in a collapsed Medicaid research facility, its entrance partially buried beneath debris from a ceiling collapse. I cleared the obstruction and entered. The interior was a chaos of overturned equipment and scattered data slates. Emergency lighting still functioned, casting everything in dim red illumination. This had been a biological research laboratory. The equipment was sophisticated. Analysis chambers, gene sequencers, isolation chambers with multiple containment protocols. I found bodies in hazmat suits. Researchers who had sealed themselves in the facility when the plague began spreading. They had not survived. The plague had found them anyway, or they had been exposed before sealing the facility. They had died at their workstations, their final actions still displayed on active terminals. I accessed the terminals, recovering data that had been abandoned when the researchers died. What I found made my hands shake with rage. The creeping pale had not been a natural plague. It had been designed, manufactured, an experimental bioweapon created by the Departamento Munitorum in conjunction with the Adeptus Mechanicus. The facility had been developing it for 3 years. The goal was to create a plague that could be deployed against Xenos populations. Something that would spread rapidly, kill efficiently, then burn itself out. A perfect weapon for purging worlds of hostile life before imperial colonization. The researchers had been testing variations, adjusting mortality rates, modifying transmission vectors, measuring how quickly different versions killed. The data logs contained detailed records. Thousands of test subjects, political prisoners, under-hive mutants, anyone the Imperium deemed expendable. They had been infected deliberately, their deaths observed and recorded, all in service to creating a more efficient weapon. And then something had gone wrong. A containment failure. The logs were fragmentary, panicked. Isolation chamber, 7 showing breach. Emergency protocols engaged. Subject escaped containment. Security teams responding. That had been the final official entry. After that, only personal logs. Researchers recording their observations as the plague they had created began killing them. "We made it too efficient," one researcher had written. "The transmission rate is beyond our projections. The mortality approaches 100%. There is no natural immunity except in approximately 0.001% of the population. The genetic markers we built in as a failsafe are too rare. We have killed ourselves. We have killed the Hive. The Emperor, forgive us." I stood in that facility reading those words over and over. 87 billion people had died because of bureaucratic negligence. Because some imperial official had decided that developing bioweapons in a Hive city was acceptable. Because the Departamento Munitorum valued theoretical weapons over the lives of the people they were sworn to protect. This was not an accident of nature, not a mutation of some underhive plague. This was murder. Sanctioned, official, imperial murder. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I had experienced before. Not hot fury, but cold hatred, absolute and total, for the Imperium, for the God Emperor who permitted this system to exist. For every authority that had valued production quotas and weapon development over human life, they had killed everyone. Meritha, Selene, Horvath, Cassandra, the Medicae survivors in the upper spire. Every single person who had died screaming and bleeding and alone. All dead because the Imperium treated human life as raw material to be consumed. I wanted to destroy something, to break terminals and overturn equipment and scream my rage into the empty facility. But what would that accomplish? The guilty were dead. The researchers had died with everyone else. The officials who had authorized this facility were corpses in the upper spire. There was no one left to punish, no one left to hold accountable. Only me, standing in a dead facility, reading the records of humanity's systematic self-destruction. I copied all the data, every file, every record, every acknowledgement of guilt, added it to my archive. This would be part of the memorial, evidence of how they died and why. Future generations needed to know, needed to understand that this was not natural disaster but engineered catastrophe. The truth mattered, even if I was the only one who would ever know it. I continued descending. Level 100, level 75, level 50, the Underhive proper. The forgotten levels where imperial law had always been more suggestion than mandate. Where gangs had ruled and mutants had hidden and the desperate had carved out existence in perpetual twilight. I expected chaos here, violence frozen in death. Instead, I found the same quiet tragedy as the levels above. The Underhive had died like everyone else. Gangers lay dead in their territorial strongholds, weapons still in their hands. Mutants had collapsed in their hidden sanctuaries, their deformed bodies cooling in darkness. The poor and desperate had died in their makeshift shelters, surrounded by the few possessions they had managed to accumulate. The plague had been egalitarian. It killed the strong and the weak, the pure and the mutant, the faithful and the heretical, all equal in death. Level 25 contained a shrine to the Emperor. Not an official ecclesiarchy chapel, but something built by the Underhive's faithful. Crude, but earnest. Walls covered in scavenged parchment bearing copied prayers. Candles, now long cold, arranged before an icon of the Emperor fashioned from scrap metal. And bodies, thousands of them. The faithful had gathered here when the plague came, had prayed together, had sought the Emperor's protection in their final hours. He had not protected them. They lay in piles before the shrine, hands still clasped in prayer, children held by parents, elderly supported by the young, a community that had faced death together, united in faith. And they had died anyway. No divine intervention, no miracle, just death, as methodical and certain as anywhere else in the Hive. I stood before the crude shrine and felt something break inside me. Not rage this time, something deeper, some final connection to faith, to belief. to the idea that there was meaning or purpose in any of this. These people had believed, had prayed, had trusted in the Emperor's protection, and he had watched them die without action, had sat upon his golden throne while 87 billion of his subjects died in agony. What kind of God permitted that? What kind of protector abandoned those who believed in him most fervently? "You do not protect," I said aloud to the shrine. My voice echoed in the chamber. "You watch. You sit in your palace while we die. You demand worship but offer nothing in return. You are not a god. You are an absence, a void we project our desperate hopes upon." The words were heresy, absolute heresy, the kind that would have brought the Inquisition down upon me with prejudice. But there was no Inquisition anymore, no ecclesiarchy to punish blasphemy, no Arbeits to enforce imperial law, only me and the dead. And the dead did not care about heresy. I continued to the absolute bottom. Level 1, the foundational level built directly on the planet's bedrock. This was where the Hive's waste systems emptied, where toxic runoff collected in vast sumps, where nothing was supposed to live except the most desperate and the most mutated. The air here was thick with chemical fumes, even through my rebreather. The water that pooled in every depression was iridescent with pollution. This was hell, the closest approximation to literal hell that the material universe offered. And people had lived here, had existed in this toxic pit because it was marginally better than dying. I found their shelters built from scrap metal and salvaged material, their bodies huddled in spaces that barely qualified as habitable. Even here, at the absolute bottom of society, the plague had found them, had killed them as efficiently as it killed the nobility in the upper spire. No one was too low to escape. No one was beneath the plague's notice. I documented everything, every level, every sector, every community. The descent took 11 days. When I finally began climbing back toward the middle hive, my supplies were nearly exhausted. My body was failing from exposure to toxic environments. My mind was fractured from witnessing the full scope of death. But I had done it. I had seen where the plague began and how it had spread and what it had done to every level of Hive society. The climb back was harder than the descent. Exhaustion and malnutrition had weakened me. Several times I had to rest for hours, sleeping on stairwell landings surrounded by corpses. Nightmares plagued every sleep period. I dreamed of drowning in bodies, of the plague researchers laughing as they released their creation, of the faithful in the Underhive shrine, praying to a god who did not answer. I would wake gasping, disoriented, unsure which level I had reached. I arrived back at the atmospheric station on the 264th day. 17 days after I had left. I had descended through 285 levels, witnessed the death of 87 billion people in complete detail, and discovered the truth of what had killed them. I added everything to the archive: the research facility data, the images from every level, the evidence of imperial culpability, all of it preserved in data slate memory and hololithic display. The shrine now told a complete story, not just who had died, but how and why. It was a monument and an accusation both, evidence of humanity's capacity for both survival and self-destruction, a warning to anyone who might find it. This is what happens when life is valued less than production. This is what happens when power is wielded without accountability. This is what happens when faith is demanded, but protection is not provided. I stood before the shrine, looking at the thousands of faces staring back at me, and understood that I had become something more than a survivor. I was a witness, a living record of extinction, the sole voice that could speak for those who had been silenced. And that role, terrible as it was, unbearable as it was, gave my continued existence purpose. The dead could not speak, but I could speak for them, and I would, for as long as I survived. The signal came on the 281st day. I was performing routine maintenance on Recycler Unit 4, when the Vox terminal activated spontaneously. Not static this time, not silence. An actual transmission. Strong, clear. Official Imperial frequency codes identifying the source as an Adeptus Arbites cruiser in high orbit. My hands froze on the maintenance tools. For several heartbeats, I could not move, could not breathe. A ship in orbit. The Imperium had returned. After 281 days of absolute isolation, after documenting 87 billion deaths, after descending into the depths and climbing back, bearing the weight of total extinction, I was no longer alone. Rescue had come. I lunged for the Vox terminal, activating the receiver. The voice that emerged was masculine, professional, emotionless in the way of all official Imperial communication. This is Arbites Cruiser Unrelenting Justice to Hive Primus Majoris. We are conducting investigation into failure to meet production quotas for the past 7 months. Respond immediately with status report. Failure to respond will result in punitive action. 7 months. They were concerned about production quotas, not the plague, not the deaths, not the extinction of an entire hive city. Production quotas. The words made something twist in my chest. Rage and bitter laughter competing for expression. But I pushed both aside. There would be time for anger later. Now there was only the desperate need to make contact, to reach that ship, to escape this tomb. This is Atmospheric Station 28547G, Hive Primus Majoris. My voice was hoarse from weeks of speaking only to myself and the dead. I cleared my throat and tried again. This is Overseer Technician Cassel Vorn. I am receiving your transmission. The Hive has suffered complete population loss due to biological contamination. Estimated 87 billion casualties. I am the sole confirmed survivor. Request immediate evacuation. Silence followed. Long enough that I feared they had not received my transmission, that some fault in the ancient Vox equipment had garbled my words. Then the voice returned, slightly less professional now. Uncertainty creeping into the flat tone. Repeat your last transmission. Did you say complete population loss? Affirmative. A plague designated the Creeping Pale killed approximately 99.999% of the Hive's population over a period of 3 months. I have documented extensive evidence. The Hive is a tomb. Everyone is dead, except me. Another pause. I heard muffled voices in the background. Multiple people on the ship discussing what I had said, debating, analyzing, making decisions about my fate, though I could not hear the specifics. When the voice returned, it belonged to a different person. Female, older, authority evident in every word. This is Captain Valoris of the Unrelenting Justice, Technician Vorn. Please clarify. You claim to be the only survivor of an 87 billion population hive? That is not credible. I have survived 281 days alone, Captain. I have explored over 200 levels. I have documented millions of deaths. I found 6 other immune survivors in the early months. They are all dead now, some from the plague, others by suicide. I am the last. You can verify by scanning the hive. Life signs will confirm my claim. More silence. I imagined the ship's Auspex systems turning toward the hive, scanning for biological signatures, searching for evidence that would support or refute my impossible claim. The wait was agonizing. Every second stretched into hours. I gripped the Vox terminal so hard my knuckles whitened. Finally, Captain Valeris spoke again. Her voice was different now, shocked, perhaps horrified. Emperor's mercy. The scans confirm. We detect one significant life sign in the entire hive structure. How is this possible? What kind of plague could achieve such total mortality? An engineered plague, Captain, developed by the Departamento Munitorum in an underhive research facility. It was an accident, a containment breach. I have recovered all the research data. I can provide complete documentation of what happened and how it spread. An engineered plague. Her voice was flat now, processing implications. That is a serious accusation, technician. It is documented fact, Captain. I have the research logs, the test subject records, the researcher's own admissions of guilt, everything. A new voice joined the transmission, male, cold in a way that suggested augmetics rather than human vocal cords. This is Interrogator Thrace of the Ordo Hereticus. Technician Vorn, you are to remain at your current location. Do not attempt to move. Do not destroy any evidence. You will be questioned extensively regarding these claims. The Ordo Hereticus. The Inquisition's daemon hunters, responsible for investigating internal threats to the Imperium. Their presence on a random Arbeits cruiser was unusual, unless they had been dispatched specifically to investigate the Hive's silence. Either way, their involvement was both promising and terrifying. The Inquisition could authorize my evacuation. They could also determine I was compromised and order my execution without trial. I understand, Interrogator. I will remain at my station. But please, I have been alone for 9 months. I just want to leave. I want to see another living person. I want to escape this tomb. Your desires are noted. Thrace's voice carried no sympathy, no warmth. Captain Valeris will determine appropriate response protocols. Stand by. The transmission went silent, not ended, but paused. I could hear background noise, ship systems, distant voices. They had not severed contact entirely. That was promising. If they planned to simply quarantine the Hive and leave me to die, they would have ended transmission. The fact that they were still connected suggested they were considering options. I waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I remained at the Vox terminal, afraid that if I moved, if I stopped monitoring, I would miss their response. My mind raced with possibilities. They would send shuttles, retrieval teams in hazmat suits. They would evacuate me to the ship, debrief me, perhaps quarantine me for observation to ensure I was not infected. But eventually, they would take me away from this place, away from the silence and the corpses and the crushing weight of being the last living soul. When Captain Valeris finally spoke again, I heard the decision in her voice before she said the words, the carefully neutral tone, the formal phrasing, the distance between her humanity and her duty. Technician Vorn. After consulting with Interrogator Thrace and reviewing the tactical situation, we have determined that evacuation is not possible at this time. The words hit like physical blows. Not possible. Not possible. I opened my mouth, but no sound emerged. Could not speak. Could not process what she had said. The risk of biological contamination is too severe, she continued, as if explaining policy rather than condemning me to death. The plague you describe has a near-perfect mortality rate. Your claimed immunity is unverified. You may be a carrier. You may be infected with a variant that shows delayed symptoms. Bringing you aboard this vessel could contaminate the entire crew, could spread the plague to other worlds. The Imperium cannot accept that risk. I am not infected. I finally managed. My voice was distant, mechanical. I have been exposed for 9 months. I have been in direct contact with plague victims. My family died in my arms. I am immune, genetically immune. The research data confirms 0.001% of the population has natural resistance. Your immunity is noted but unverified, Thrace interjected. The Ordo Hereticus cannot authorize evacuation based on your self-assessment. The risk to the Imperium is too great. Then test me. Send down medical equipment. I will submit to any examination, any verification protocol you require. Just do not leave me here. Silence. I could hear them conferring again. Low voices debating my fate. I pressed my face against the Vox terminal, as if physical proximity could influence their decision. As if they could see my desperation through the transmission, Captain Valeris returned. "Technician Vorn, we appreciate your situation. Truly, but our orders are clear. Hive Primus Majoris is to remain under absolute quarantine until such time as the biological threat is neutralized. No personnel will be deployed to the surface. No evacuations will be authorized. The Hive is a contamination zone. It must remain sealed. For how long?" The question emerged as a whisper. Indefinitely. The word hung in the air. Indefinitely. Not days or weeks or months. Forever. Or until I died. Whichever came first. They were leaving me here, abandoning me to slow death by starvation or madness or eventual decision that continued existence was not worth the effort. Please. I hated the begging tone in my voice, hated the weakness it revealed, but I was beyond pride. I am loyal. I have served the Imperium faithfully my entire life. I have survived when everyone else died. I have documented everything for your investigation. I have preserved evidence. Do not leave me here to die alone." "Your loyalty is noted," Thrace said, his augmented voice devoid of emotion. "Your service is appreciated, but the Imperium's needs supersede individual survival. One life measured against billions. The calculus is clear. 87 billion just died here. What are billions measured against that?" "Those billions are already dead," Thrace replied. "We speak of living billions on other worlds who could be contaminated if we breach quarantine protocols. Your suffering is regrettable, but necessary. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one." I wanted to scream at them, to curse them with every blasphemy I had accumulated during 281 days of isolation, to tell them exactly what I thought of their calculus and their protocols and their cold imperial logic that valued theoretical risk over actual human suffering. But what would it accomplish? They had made their decision. Nothing I said would change it. "Will you at least take the data?" I asked finally. "The documentation I have collected, the evidence of what happened, the research logs proving this was an Imperial weapons program gone wrong. Someone should know, someone should preserve the record." Another pause. Then Captain Valeris spoke, and I heard something in her voice. Not sympathy exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition that they were condemning me while benefiting from my work. "We will receive data transmission. Upload everything you have to the Vox channel. We will ensure it reaches appropriate authorities." Appropriate authorities. More faceless bureaucrats who would file it away and forget about it. But it was better than nothing. Better than the archive, dying with me, forgotten and unacknowledged. I began uploading. The process took hours. Thousands of images, millions of words of documentation, medical data, research logs, the names and faces of 7 million documented deaths. Everything I had collected transferred to the ship's data banks. While the upload processed, I spoke with Captain Valeris. Not official communication now, just conversation. Two humans speaking across the void between ship and Hive. She told me about the sector, about other worlds, about the Imperium continuing despite the death of one Hive. News that should have comforted but felt like confirmation of my own insignificance. 87 billion deaths barely registered. The Imperium was too vast for individual tragedy to matter. I told her about my family, about Meritha and Selene, about watching them die while being powerless to save them, about the other survivors who had chosen death over isolation, about descending through 285 levels and witnessing death in every form, about becoming the keeper of memory for billions who would otherwise be forgotten. She listened, did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that stayed with me long after the transmission ended. "What you have done, Technician Vorn, preserving that record, bearing witness to what happened, that is not insignificant. That is the highest form of service. You gave meaning to their deaths by refusing to let them be forgotten. The Imperium may not acknowledge it, may not reward it, but it matters. They mattered because you made them matter. Will anyone ever see the archive? I asked. I do not know, but it exists now. It is preserved. That is more than most of the dead receive. The upload completed on the 302nd hour of transmission. Everything I had collected, everything I had documented, now stored in the ship's databanks, safe from the decay that would eventually claim the Hive. My life's work, such as it was, preserved. Upload received and verified, Captain Valoris confirmed. Technician Vorn, the unrelenting justice, will maintain orbital position for 72 hours. After that, we will depart to continue our patrol circuit. Is there anything else we can provide? Can you stay? The words emerged before I could stop them. Childish, desperate. Just stay in orbit. I know you cannot evacuate me, but knowing you are there, knowing I can transmit and someone will hear, that would be something. That would make the silence bearable. I am sorry. We have orders. Other systems require investigation. We cannot remain indefinitely. Then go, I said, bitterness replacing desperation. Leave me to die alone like you were always going to. At least be honest about it. Technician Vorn, go. Just go. And tell your appropriate authorities that 87 billion people died because the Imperium weaponized a plague it could not control. Tell them that when I finally die, it will be their fault as surely as if they pulled the trigger. Tell them the Emperor does not protect. He just watches while we suffer. That is heresy, Technician. Then execute me for it. Oh wait, you already are. You are just making me do it myself. Silence followed. I had crossed lines, said things that in any other circumstance would result in immediate execution, but I was already condemned, already dead by their reckoning. What additional punishment could they threaten? We will depart in 72 hours, Captain Valoris said finally. Her voice was careful, controlled. I am sorry, Technician Vorn. Truly. May the Emperor grant you peace. The Emperor grants nothing, I replied. The transmission did not end immediately. They maintained the connection for the promised 72 hours. I spoke to various crew members during that time. Ship's officers, tech priests, even some of the regular crew who were curious about the man who had survived alone for 9 months. They asked questions. I answered. We spoke of mundane things. Weather on their last port of call, food in the ship's mess. The small details of normal life that seemed impossibly distant. But eventually, the 72 hours expired. Captain Valeris made final contact. Technician Vorn, the unrelenting justice is departing now. The Hive will remain under quarantine. No other ships will be permitted to approach. You will not be contacted again. I am sorry. Emperor, protect you. Goodbye, Captain, I said. Then added, because some part of me still believed in courtesy despite everything. Thank you for listening. It helped. For a while, it helped. You are welcome. Die well, Technician. The transmission ended. I watched through the observation port on level 300 as the ship's engines flared. A brief, bright light in the toxic sky. Then it was gone, ascending to orbit, engaging warp drives, leaving the system entirely, taking with it the last connection to living humanity. I stood at that observation port for 6 hours, watching empty sky, hoping irrationally that the ship would return, that Captain Valeris would disobey orders and send a shuttle, that someone would decide one life was worth saving. But the sky remained empty. Toxic clouds drifted. Distant factorums glowed on the horizon. the universe continued its indifferent processes. Eventually, I returned to the atmospheric station, to the shrine, to the faces of the dead staring from every wall. I had been given hope for 3 days, had believed that rescue was possible, had dared to imagine a future beyond this tomb, and that hope had been taken away, crushed by imperial calculus and quarantine protocols and the cold arithmetic that measured one life against theoretical billions. The weight of absolute isolation settled on me again, heavier now than before, because now I knew for certain no one was coming. No one would save me. I would die here, in this hive, surrounded by 87 billion corpses. And when I died, the silence would finally be complete. The universe would not notice. The Imperium would not care. My death would be as insignificant as my life had been. Just another statistic, another casualty, another name that no one would remember. I looked at the shrine, at Meritha's face among thousands, at Selen's innocent smile frozen in hololithic memory, at all the dead I had documented, and I understood that this was my fate. To join them, to become part of the silence I had fought against for so long. But not yet, not today. The archive existed now, preserved in the ship's databanks. The dead had been remembered. My purpose was fulfilled, yet I continued, breathing, existing, because the alternative required action I still could not bring myself to take. So I resumed my routine, maintained the recyclers, spoke to the dead, filled the silence with sound, and waited for the inevitable end that would come when my body finally failed or my mind finally broke. The last living soul in Hive Primus Majoris. Abandoned, forgotten, alone until death granted release. The year mark came on the 365th day, one full cycle around the planet's star, since the plague had begun its systematic extinction of 87 billion lives. I marked the occasion by standing before the shrine and speaking each name I could remember. Not all 7 million I had documented. That would have taken weeks. But the ones who had mattered personally: Meritha, Selen, Horvath, Cassandra, Valeria and her Medicae team, the suicide victims whose final words I had preserved. I spoke their names into the silence and tried to believe it meant something. The ship's departure had changed me. I could feel it in the way I moved through the hive now, not with the desperate energy of early exploration, nor with the methodical determination of documentation, but with acceptance. I had been given a glimpse of salvation and watched it depart. There was a kind of peace in knowing absolutely that no rescue would come. It removed uncertainty, clarified my purpose. I was not waiting to be saved. I was simply existing until I did not. I had stopped counting days after 400. The number ceased to matter. Time had become a meaningless progression of identical moments. Wake, eat, maintain the recyclers, explore, document, return, sleep, repeat. The routine was not survival strategy anymore. It was ritual, structure imposed on chaos to maintain the fiction of purpose. But the purpose was not entirely fictional. The archive remained, grew. I had documented 7 million deaths in detail, but there were 87 billion total. 80 billion remained unrecorded, unremembered, anonymous dead whose names and faces would be lost forever if I did not preserve them. So I continued the work, not because I believed anyone would see it, but because the work itself was the point. The act of bearing witness, of saying to the universe that these people had existed and their deaths mattered, even if only to one survivor going slowly mad in isolation. I expanded the shrine systematically. The atmospheric station's walls could not contain the growing memorial, so I moved into adjacent spaces, cleared out storage chambers, requisitioned abandoned hab units, covered every available surface with hololithic projectors displaying faces, names beneath each image, dates of birth when I could recover them, Dates of death estimated from decomposition and position. Occupations. Family relationships where evident. Lives reduced to data, but data treated as sacred. The work took on religious dimensions. Each morning I would approach the shrine and perform what I came to think of as devotions. I would activate the hololithic displays, watch thousands of faces materialize from darkness, and I would speak to them, not prayers. The Emperor had proven his indifference, but acknowledgements, recognitions. You lived. You mattered. I remember you. You are not forgotten. Some days, I would focus on a single individual, recover their identification, research what I could find about their life, employment records, educational certifications, medical histories, the fragments that survived in databanks. I would piece together a biography from scraps. Then I would tell their story aloud, narrate their life to the empty shrine as if congregation listened, as if my words could resurrect them somehow. There was a woman named Delara Prine, textile worker on level 287, age 34 at death, married to Joram Prine, also deceased. 2 children, both deceased. Her employment file noted 17 years of service without disciplinary action, consistently met production quotas. Once received commendation for identifying efficiency improvement in textile reclamation process. She had been a good worker, a good citizen. Someone the Imperium would classify as useful. She had died in her HAB unit with her family. I found them together, arms intertwined even in death. Her final action, based on positioning, had been pulling her children close, protecting them even though protection was impossible. She had been human in the best sense, loving, faithful to duty, trying her best within a system that gave her almost nothing and demanded everything. I told her story to the shrine, spoke for 20 minutes about Delara Prine and her 17 years of textile reclamation service and her love for her family and her meaningless death. When I finished, I added her face to the hololithic displays. One more name among millions, one more life acknowledged. This became my pattern. Every day, I would select someone, research their life, tell their story, add them to the shrine. The work was endless, would remain endless even if I lived another 50 years. But the impossibility did not matter. What mattered was that each day, another person was remembered, another life was given meaning through witness. I spoke with the dead constantly now, not just during formal acknowledgements, but throughout the day. Casual conversation with people who could not hear me. I would tell them about the recyclers I was maintaining, about sectors I had explored, about my own past, my memories of life before the silence. The conversations were obviously mad. I knew this, acknowledged it, but madness had become preferable to the alternative clarity of absolute isolation. Sometimes the dead spoke back. Not really. I understood the voices were hallucinations, products of a mind starved for social interaction. But when I was working alone in the atmospheric station and heard Maritha's voice suggesting I should eat something, or when I was exploring a new sector and heard Cassandra warning me about unstable flooring, I chose to accept the hallucinations as real. They were all I had, all that remained of human connection. My physical condition continued deteriorating. The reflection in mirrors showed a skeletal figure, skin stretched tight over prominent bones. My hair had gone completely gray despite being only 37 years old. My hands shook with tremors I could not control. Malnutrition, despite adequate food. Depression, suppressing appetite to the point where eating became a chore I had to force myself to complete. My body was shutting down slowly, consuming itself, preparing for death even as my mind insisted on continued function. I treated the deterioration with clinical detachment, documented my own decline as I had documented the plague's progression, recorded symptoms, measured weight loss, noted the increasing frequency of dizzy spells and moments of confusion. I was both subject and observer of my own dying, the last case study in the archive of extinction. When I finally died, the documentation would be complete. Birth to death of Hive Primus Majoris, including the prolonged death of its final inhabitant. On what I estimated was the 500th day, I discovered I was not entirely alone. The realization came while exploring Level 310, a sector I had not previously visited. I found evidence of recent movement. Not human. The bodies here had been disturbed, partially consumed. Rats had returned to the hive. I found them in a storage facility, hundreds of them, thriving on the abundance of corpses. They had died during the initial plague like everything else, but their reproductive cycle was shorter than humans. A few immune individuals had survived, reproduced, repopulated, life reasserting itself in the simplest form. The sight should have disgusted me. Instead, I felt something like joy, life, moving, breathing, eating, not human but alive. I was not the sole living thing in the hive anymore. I watched the rats for hours, observed their behavior. They avoided me, skittering away when I approached, but they were there. Real, tangible proof that life could persist even in a tomb. That death was not absolute. That given time, given opportunity, biology found a way to continue. The rats would survive after I died, would continue their cycles of feeding and reproduction, would inherit the hive when I could no longer maintain even the fiction of human habitation. The thought was strangely comforting. The hive would not remain empty forever. Something would live here, would make use of the structure, would continue the endless process of life, consuming death and producing new life. I was witnessing not just an ending, but a transition. From human habitation to something else. From civilization to nature reclaiming space. It was the natural order. Empires rose and fell. Species emerged and went extinct. The universe continued regardless. I began leaving food for the rats. Nutrient blocks broken into small pieces placed in areas where I had seen them. Not because they needed it. They had 87 billion corpses to feed on. But because the act of providing felt important. A gesture toward life, toward continuation, toward something beyond my own isolated existence. The rats multiplied. I would see them throughout the middle hive now, moving through corridors, nesting in abandoned hab units, claiming territory, establishing their own hierarchy and social structures. They fought among themselves, competed for resources, reproduced, died, lived, the full spectrum of existence playing out at accelerated pace. In a year, they had gone from near extinction to thriving population. What might they become in 10 years? 100? Would they evolve? Adapt to the unique environment of the hive? Become something new? I documented them as I had documented everything else. Recorded their numbers, their behavior, their expansion through the levels. Added them to the archive, not as footnote, but as critical data, evidence that extinction was not permanent, that life persisted, that even in the worst catastrophe, something survived to begin again. The revelation gave me new purpose, or perhaps clarified existing purpose. I was not just preserving memory of the dead, I was bearing witness to transition, recording the death of one world and the birth of another. The hive was transforming, from human city to animal habitat, from structured civilization to organic chaos. And I was the sole observer of that transformation, the only one who could document both what had been and what was becoming. I created a new section of the archive, After Humanity. Images of the rats, observations about their behavior, speculation about their future, detailed maps showing their population spread. This would be part of the record too. Future explorers, if any came, would see not just the death, but what came after, would understand that endings were also beginnings. Physical writing became difficult as my tremors worsened, so I recorded audio logs instead, speaking observations into data slate recorders. My voice was different now, hoarse, broken. Sometimes I would speak for hours without pause, stream of consciousness rambling that mixed observation with philosophy with memory. The logs were barely coherent, but coherence was not the goal. Completeness was. I needed to externalize everything, get it out of my head and into recordable form before my mind failed entirely. Some logs were addressed to no one, just observations spoken into void. Others were addressed to specific people. To Meritha, I confessed that I had failed her, failed to protect our family, failed to see the danger until too late, failed to save her or give her painless death. To Selene, I apologized for the world I had brought her into, for the life she had been denied, for dying before she could truly live. To the Imperium, I raged, detailed every failure, every cruelty, every moment of callous disregard for human life. The logs became confession and accusation both. I recorded messages for hypothetical future discoverers. To whoever finds this, I am Cassel Vorn. I was the last. For however long I survived, I bore witness. I remembered them, all of them. Their names are preserved here. Their faces, their stories when I could recover them. They lived, they died, they mattered because I made them matter. Do not forget them again. The messages were probably pointless. If anyone found the hive, they would likely purge it with fire rather than investigate. Biological contamination zones were typically sterilized rather than studied. The archive would be destroyed along with everything else. But I recorded the messages anyway, because maybe, because perhaps, because hope dies last, even when everything else is already dead. I found myself returning to the Underhive Shrine, the crude temple where thousands had died praying. I had not returned since my initial descent. The memory of that place, of faith revealed as useless, had been too painful. Of purpose, of whether any of this mattered in a universe that permitted such casual extinction. The bodies were still there, still positioned in prayer. The rats had been at them, but the faithful remained recognizable, hands clasped, heads bowed, frozen in final supplication. I sat among them and tried to understand what they had felt in those last moments. Had their faith survived the plague? Had they died believing the Emperor would receive them? Or had they died knowing they had been abandoned, praying anyway because prayer was all they had left? I spoke to them. Not prayers, but questions. Did you know? Did you understand that he would not save you? Or did you die still believing? No answer came, only silence. The same silence that had answered their prayers. The same silence that filled the entire hive. But sitting there among the faithful dead, I realized something. Their faith had not been about salvation. Not really. They had not prayed because they believed prayer would change their circumstances. They had prayed because prayer gave them dignity in death. Because facing the end together, united in shared ritual, made dying bearable. Their faith had not saved them, but it had given them community in final moments, had made them more than victims, had made them humans facing death with courage and connection. That was meaning, not divine intervention or cosmic justice, but human beings choosing to maintain humanity even when humanity was ending, choosing connection over isolation, choosing dignity over despair. They had died as humans, not as animals. I began visiting the shrine regularly, sitting among the dead faithful, speaking my own form of prayer, not to the Emperor, but to the dead themselves, thanking them for the lesson they had taught without knowing, acknowledging their courage, their humanity, their choice to die together rather than alone. And slowly, over weeks and months, I found my own form of acceptance. Not of death, but of what I was, what I had become. I was not a survivor trying to escape, not a victim awaiting rescue. I was a witness, a keeper of memory, a guardian of the shrine. That was my purpose, not assigned by the Imperium or the Emperor, but chosen by me, self-determined, in a life where choice had always been illusion. The dead could not speak, but I could speak for them, could preserve their memory, could ensure that their lives had meaning beyond simply filling production quotas and dying when convenient. That was not the purpose I would have chosen, but it was the purpose I had found. And in accepting it, in embracing it fully, I found something approaching peace. Not happiness. Happiness was impossible in a tomb, but acceptance, understanding, a quiet resignation that was not defeat but acknowledgement of reality. I would die here, alone, unmourned except by myself. But before I died, I would complete the work, would document as much as possible, would create a memorial so comprehensive that no one could deny these people had lived. That was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all I had. I am dying now. The tremors have become constant. My vision blurs. Food no longer stays down. Days or weeks remain. Not more. I have completed what I could. 7 million documented. 80 billion remain anonymous. I failed them, but I tried. That must be enough. The rats watch from shadows. They will inherit this place. Life continues, even when I cannot. To whoever finds this archive, if anyone ever does, their names are here, their faces, their stories. 87 billion people lived in Hive Primus Majoris. They worked, they loved, they prayed. They died because the Imperium valued weapons over lives. They died alone and afraid and unremembered except by me. I was Cassel Vorn, atmospheric technician, husband, father, the last living soul in a city of the dead. I bore witness. I remembered them. They mattered because I made them matter. That is what it means to be the last. To carry the weight of all who came before. To ensure they are not forgotten. I remember you. All of you.